4-2. And really I'm calling it 4-3 on the video, so in case anybody wants to go back and look. Today we're going to talk about two main kinds of experimental design. The first main kind is something called blocking. So you might remember that earlier we talked about like stratifying things and separating things out when we're doing experiments. And one of the things that happened is when we were doing that, we randomized things first and then we selected the groups. In blocking, you do it the other way around. So you know that certain things are going to be happening and you want to see maybe the difference between how males and females respond. So you automatically separate them to start out with. One block is male, one block is female, and then within those blocks, you randomly assign. So that's one of the main differences. Okay, it's very distinct groups. Usually, not always, usually there are two blocks, but not always. All right, so blocking is an experimental design that helps factor out a lurking variable. We've talked about this lurking variable that could confound our results. And it's a group of experimental units that are known before you start the experiment to be similar in some way that might affect a response, like the difference between males and females' responses. The random assignment of these units is carried out separately within the block. So you block first, then randomly assign. Men and women respond differently to advertising in this example, and researchers want to design an experiment to compare the effectiveness of 3 advertisements. So part A, and this is all done for us, but part A, we're going to outline a randomized block design using 300 volunteers. Notice that there are 180 men, and there are 120 women, and that these are not the same size. So down below, when we block these out, you'll notice the 120 women and the 180 men are blocked first before any random assignment is given. Then, afterwards, that's when we talk about this random assignment, whereas that would have been done beforehand. And the 3 different groups are assigned by that random assignment, and so you can see that in these different random assignments, we have 3 groups each. And you can include the add under the group 1, the add under the group 2, that kind of thing. You don't have to have it as separate, in my opinion. And then always at the end, you compare. Okay, so it still pretty much looks the same. It's just the blocking becomes before the random assignment. That's the kind of the main idea of what blocking is all about. It says, describe it. So this is what we talked about yesterday, where not only are you going to draw this diagram to show the reader what's going on, but you're also going to tell them in words. So basically this next paragraph is just about what you did. So we randomized the 120 women into 3 groups of 40, 1 for each of the advertising treatments. We're going to give each woman a distinct label between 0, 0, 1, and 120, because you need 3 digits since there's more than 100. And we're going to use a random number table to sort these numbers. The labels correspond to the 1 through 40 would be the first 40 women and add 1, so on and so forth. We're going to do the same thing to the men, but now with 180. Now, the random table is not the only way you can assign things, but for our purposes in our class, it's probably the easiest one to describe to the reader since you're given a random table anyways for the test. Okay, so in this next part, they oftentimes explain why this randomized block is a good design, and rather than do just a completely random kind of thing, males and females mixed in. And so when you do this, you consider both subjects, men and women, if it's just completely randomized, in one single pool. That random assignment would send them to the 3 treatment groups without regard to their gender, and that is going to ignore the differences between men and women. So if you're trying to figure out how men and women react differently, that might confound what you're trying to find. There'll be a lot of variability, and it makes it harder to compare the effectiveness of the ad. So you want to see, how about for men, how about for women? Maybe you need to change your ad design depending on what gender you're looking at. The randomized block makes you look at the men and women separately. In this random assignment, occurs in each block, and blocking controls for the variability responses due to the gender. So what you're doing is you're eliminating just the gender piece. So that's what blocking does. It eliminates one of the pieces of variability. Yeah, I think that's about it. So as we look at this, a cell phone company is considering two different types of keyboards. So I don't know, how many people here have a touch keyboard on their cell phone? Okay, so a lot of you. How many have just the slider or the clam keyboard? Anybody have a flip phone and use that? Okay, so a few. So depending on the keyboard, oftentimes determines how fast you can text and maybe the responsiveness of your touch screen. So researchers would like to conduct an experiment using the subjects who are frequent texters. So I noticed right away in my words, I'm looking for key phrases. So here are your frequent texters versus those who are not frequent texters. Or maybe experts and non-experts. Question? And they're going to be asked several different, to send several different messages in 5 minutes, and the response will be the number of correctly typed words. So for all of us who use abbreviation, that's kind of a problem maybe, I don't know. In part A, why do we want to use a randomized block design instead of just a completely randomized design? Okay, autocorrect, maybe there's autocorrect. What else? Aaron?
I don't know.
Well, then shut up. Anybody else? Okay, so non-frequent texters are slower. So one of the problems, like if you're blocking like we did for the males and the females, men and women might react differently to ads. People who use their phone all the time to text are going to be much more familiar with where the letters are on the keyboard. So one of the things that you can block for is who is good or not good, maybe, at texting. And that's what we're going to write down. All right, in part A. So, let's see. Non-blocking for texting ability would increase, and this is the word that they like to use a lot, so get ready to use this frequently when you describe this, the variability between texters. Blocking for texting experience allows us to better evaluate the difference in the response variable which in this case was correctly typed words, right?
Yeah.
Thank you. Number correctly typed words. So there were many suggestions in the beginning about what we could talk about that would change somebody's number of correctly typed words. But back in the paragraph, the main things that they were talking about that we highlighted were these frequent texters and non-frequent texters. So that's what you want to block for. B. In part B, if we draw our diagram, and outline a randomization, we know that we start with 300 texters. And after we have these 300 textures, we block for the what do they call it up above? Experienced texters?
Yeah. Frequent.
Frequent. So frequent texters. And how many of those were there? 100, thank you. And then the non-frequent texters. And those are 200. And then we randomly assign them and then within the random assignment for the frequent texters, there were going to be half of those, I'm assuming here, 50. Do they give a name to the different kinds of keyboards? Thank you. 50A and 50B. And then for the non-frequent, that would then be 100A and 100B. And then afterwards, of course, we would compare the results. And then you do the same thing down here as well. And what you're looking for is what's happening within these two different blocks, groups. You just write a short paragraph, a few sentences about this, just like we have in the past. They ask you to describe how you would carry out this experiment. So we drew the rubric diagram. But then afterwards, right now, why don't you take the next couple minutes and, just like we had in the previous example, write a few sentences talking about, okay, we're going to take the 300 texters. We are going to block for frequent and non-frequent texters. After we do that, we'll randomly assign, tell them how you're going to randomly assign 50 people from the frequent to group A, 50 to group B, and then in the end, talk about comparing the results. Take a few minutes to do that. Okay, the last thing that we're going to talk about is something called a matched pair. Matched pair design is when you're looking at two things.